Having said that, it was also written down, and it was written down in the time of the prophet. And it was written down in a very rudimentary, simple form of writing Arabic that later needed to be elaborated and was elaborated into several different so-called readings, which means that the voweling or vocalization differs because the vowel marks were not put in the original text. So there are some differences in that respect, but there are very few differences in the actual letters themselves between different readings. Basically, that is a solidly established text. It was written down, and as a written text, it held pride of place as the only thing written in Arabic for a substantial amount of time, maybe a couple of generations perhaps, or at least a generation anyway. And they would write it in very large, huge tomes that would be written on parchment or papyrus and bound together in big volumes that were probably not too numerous. Of course, writing was also used for secular purposes like letters, deeds, contracts, things like that, and as evidenced by plenty of papyri from Egypt. Okay. The earliest dated text of the Qur'an dates from the year 72, or the year 691, and that is the inscription in the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock, which is one of the two mosques in Jerusalem in the sacred enclosure there, is actually the oldest standing Muslim building. The Dome of the Rock dates from 691, and so does the Dome of the inscription, and that is the oldest dated Quran inscription that exists. It has Quranic verses, a quite number of verses there that accord quite with the text. So that reveals another truth in the situation, which is that although there is some time between these revelations and the earliest dated inscription, that time isn't very much. It's very little if one contrasts it with biblical texts. In the case of the Bible, the difference between the earliest manuscripts of the various books and the apparent date of the book's origin, or the date which is claimed for it by the book's own superscription, it is often much greater. And that leads to a problem in the explanation of the unfolding of Islam, which is that there is quite an extreme compression of time at which you get very quickly to a big developed literature, and it becomes quite impossible then to assert that things were fabricated later and that they didn't go back to an earlier origin. So to some extent, the story of the transmission of the Qur'an is pretty unshakable. Now, that doesn't necessarily, in interreligious dialogues situations, have consequences that would necessarily be a disadvantage for Christianity or Judaism. All that means is the Qur'an is accepted by most historians, including most non-Muslim ones, as going back authentically to the Prophet Muhammad. But whether the Prophet Muhammad received it from God, that is another question. And one can find other parallel texts. One would suppose then that the authentication of the transmission of the Book of Mormon from Joseph Smith would be even more perfect and flawless, because that came in the 19th century, and furthermore not merely written in a book, but printed no less, and approved by the prophet himself and so on, so that original copies of that exist. And yet, for the non-Mormon part of the world, that doesn't necessarily mean that that came from God. So the fact that the text is very ancient, it doesn't necessarily prove that, simply that its transmission is quite solid. But it is the case anyway with the Qur'an that the transmission then is rather solid. There are believed now to be manuscripts which date from approximately this same date or earlier. And some of those were found recently in a mosque in Yemen, and they exist in various places. And as I said, the exact dating of the manuscripts has not been established. So that there is still an acrimonious debate that rages about that particular subject, and one which unfortunately is often not informed by good information. So